The thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the dusty main street of Clifton Hill, Missouri, as Abigail Sinclair struggled against the iron grips of two men who were forcing her toward a waiting horse. Her heart pounded as fiercely as the approaching storm clouds gathering on the horizon of that fateful summer day in 1878, her cries for help drowned by the wind and the indifference of onlookers too afraid to intervene. "Let me go!" Abigail screamed, the elegant blue dress she wore now torn at the hem from her desperate attempts to escape. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its carefully arranged style, cascading down her back as she fought. "I won't go with you. Someone help me." The taller of the two men, with a jagged scar running down his cheek, laughed cruelly. "Ain't nobody gonna help you, Miss Sinclair. Your pa's debts are due, and Mr. Blackwell collects one way or another. My father would never agree to this." Abigail kicked and twisted, her boots scraping in the dirt as they lifted her toward the saddle. The second man, shorter but broader across the shoulders, growled, "Your pa ain't got no say anymore, girl. Not since we found him face down in that creek." The words struck Abigail like physical blows, momentarily halting her struggles. Her father dead. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, grief and terror mingling into a potent cocktail that threatened to overwhelm her. The moment of shock was all they needed. The men hoisted her higher, preparing to throw her across the saddle of the waiting horse when the sound of rapid hoofbeats approached from the east end of town. "What the scarred man began, turning just as a massive chestnut stallion thundered to a halt nearby. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements quick and decisive. Tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the shadow cast by his hat, he moved with the confidence of a man who knew his own strength. "I believe the lady said no," the newcomer stated, his voice deep and steady. The scarred man sneered. "Mind your business, stranger, unless you're looking to die today. Hurting a woman in broad daylight on Main Street seems like everybody's business," the newcomer replied, stepping closer. Now Abigail could see him clearly, ruggedly handsome, with piercing blue eyes that assessed the situation with cold calculation. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the six-shooter holstered at his hip looked well-maintained and ready for use. "This ain't your concern," the broader man said, his hand moving to his gun. The movement proved to be a mistake. Before either man could properly draw, the stranger moved with lightning speed. A swift punch connected with the scarred man's jaw, sending him staggering backward. As the broader man fumbled with his weapon, the stranger's boot connected with his knee with a sickening crack, dropping him to the ground with a howl of pain. The scarred man recovered enough to lunge forward, but the stranger sidestepped and delivered another punishing blow that sent him sprawling into the horse trough with a tremendous splash. In the confusion, Abigail had fallen to the ground. The stranger was at her side in an instant, helping her to her feet with a surprisingly gentle touch. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his eyes quickly scanning for injuries. "No," Abigail managed, still stunned by the rapid turn of events. "But they said my father—" "No time," the stranger cut in, glancing at the two men who were already beginning to recover. "Those aren't the type to stay down for long, and I'd wager they have friends nearby." He looked toward the gathering crowd. "Is there somewhere safe you can go?" Abigail shook her head, tears threatening. "I don't know. If what they said is true, then my home." The stranger made a quick decision. "Then you're coming with me. Can you ride?" Before she could fully answer, he was guiding her toward his horse. With surprising strength, he lifted her into the saddle and swung up behind her in one smooth motion. The two men were on their feet now, the scarred one drawing his pistol with murderous intent. "Hold on tight," the stranger murmured close to her ear. And then they were off, the powerful horse lunging forward as a shot cracked through the air, missing them by inches. They thundered down the main street of Clifton Hill and out into the open countryside, the horse's powerful stride putting distance between them and their pursuers with every second. Abigail clung to the saddle horn, the stranger's arm around her waist the only thing keeping her from falling as they raced away from the town that had been her home for all 22 years of her life. "Where are we going?" she shouted over the wind and the pounding of hooves. "Somewhere safe," he answered, guiding the horse off the main trail and into a stand of cottonwoods that followed the path of a shallow creek. Only when they were deep within the shelter of the trees did the stranger slow their pace, listening carefully for sounds of pursuit. The horse's breathing was heavy but controlled, suggesting it was used to such exertions. "I think we've lost them for now," he said, finally allowing the horse to stop in a small clearing. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Abigail down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her in waves. The stranger steadied her with a strong hand. "Thank you," she said, finally looking up into the face of her rescuer. "I don't even know your name." "Yates." "Yates Preston," he replied, removing his hat briefly in a gesture of courtesy that seemed at odds with the dangerous competence he'd displayed moments earlier. "And you are?" "Abigail Sinclair," she answered, her voice catching. "Those men, they said my father is dead, that he owed money to someone named Blackwell." Yates's expression darkened. "Victor Blackwell, I know the name. He's been buying up land all over the county by fair means or foul." He led the horse to the creek, allowing it to drink. "Is there anyone else who might help you? Family, friends?" Abigail shook her head, struggling to contain her emotions. "My mother died years ago. It's been just father and me since I was 12. We have had the mercantile in town." She paused, a thought striking her. "Mrs. Caldwell at the boarding house might help, but if Blackwell's men are looking for me, they'd check there first." Yates finished her thought. He considered for a moment. "My cabin's about 3 hours' ride from here. It's not much, but it's defensible and off the main trails. We can go there, figure out our next move." Abigail regarded him warily. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Preston? You don't know me." A shadow crossed his face. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people don't step in to stop men like Blackwell." He adjusted his gun belt. "Besides, no decent man stands by while a lady's being manhandled in the street." There was something in his tone, a combination of conviction and old pain, that made Abigail trust him despite the circumstances. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no choice. "Thank you," she said again, more firmly this time. "I don't know how I'll repay you, but I will." Yates shook his head. "Let's worry about keeping you alive first. Rest a few minutes, then we need to move. They'll be organizing a proper search soon." While the horse rested, Yates explained that he'd been in Clifton Hill to sell furs and restock supplies when he'd witnessed her predicament. He was, by trade, both a trapper and occasional guide for hunting expeditions, living mostly in solitude in the forested hills to the north. After allowing the horse a brief respite, they set off again, this time at a more sustainable pace. Yates kept them off the main trails, following game paths and creek beds that would be difficult to track. As they rode, Abigail found herself growing increasingly aware of the man whose chest pressed against her back, whose arms occasionally brushed hers as he guided the horse. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, she felt oddly secure in his presence. The sun was beginning to set when they finally approached a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping, partially concealed by tall pines. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was home. Abigail tensed. "I thought you lived alone." "I do," Yates replied, immediately alert. He pulled the horse to a stop behind a thicket. "Wait here." He dismounted silently, drawing his pistol as he crept toward the cabin. Abigail watched, heart in her throat, as he approached with the caution of a man well accustomed to danger. He circled the structure once, peering through the single window before moving to the door. A moment later, he motioned for her to join him. "It's safe," he called softly. "Just my friend Samuel. He sometimes checks on the place when I'm gone." Relieved but still wary, Abigail dismounted and made her way to the cabin. Inside, a Native American man of middle years was tending a small fire in the hearth. He looked up as they entered, dark eyes assessing Abigail curiously. "Samuel, this is Miss Abigail Sinclair," Yates introduced. "Miss Sinclair, Samuel 2 Rivers. He's Osage and the best tracker this side of the Mississippi." Samuel nodded in greeting. "The fire was cold when I arrived," he explained to Yates. "I thought you might return tonight." "We're fortunate you were here," Yates replied. "Miss Sinclair is in trouble, Blackwell's men." Samuel's expression hardened at the name. "That explains the riders." 4 men asking questions at Jackson's Creek. "Already," Yates frowned. "They're moving faster than I expected. Did they follow you here?" Samuel shook his head. "No one follows me unless I wish it." There was quiet pride in the statement, not boastfulness. "But they are determined." Offering gold for information. Abigail sank onto a bench near the fire, the events of the day catching up with her. "They said my father is dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Drowned in the creek. But that doesn't make sense. He was a strong swimmer." Yates and Samuel exchanged glances. "Blackwell's men have a way of making accidents happen," Samuel said gently. "What did your father owe him?" Yates asked, pouring water from a pitcher into a cup and offering it to her. Abigail took the water gratefully. "Nothing, as far as I know. Our mercantile was doing well. We even expanded last year." She frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Father did mention someone making offers to buy the store recently, but he wasn't interested in selling." "The store sits on the corner of Main Street and River Road, doesn't it?" Yates asked. Abigail nodded. "Prime location," he muttered, "especially if someone was looking to control commerce in the town." Samuel moved to the window, peering out at the darkening forest. "I should go watch the trails, see what they're planning." "Be careful," Yates cautioned. "These aren't ordinary thugs." Samuel smiled thinly. "Neither am I, my friend." He nodded respectfully to Abigail. "Miss Sinclair, I am sorry for your father. He was known as an honest man." After Samuel left, Abigail felt the full weight of her situation descend. She was alone in a cabin with a man she'd met only hours ago, her father likely dead, her home unsafe to return to, and dangerous men searching for her. The enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Yates seemed to sense her distress. "You should eat something," he said, moving to a small pantry area. "Nothing fancy, I'm afraid." "I'm not hungry," Abigail replied automatically, though she couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. "You need your strength," he insisted, putting together a simple meal of jerky, hard cheese, and slightly stale bread. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do, but tonight you need to rest." The simple practicality of his words grounded her, and Abigail found herself accepting the food. They ate in relative silence, the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside the only sounds disturbing the quiet. "You can take the bed," Yates said when they'd finished eating. "I'll sleep by the fire." Abigail glanced at the narrow cot against the far wall. "I couldn't possibly displace you. You're not," he interrupted firmly. "I sleep out here half the time anyway. More comfortable for me." Something in his tone suggested it wasn't entirely true, but Abigail was too exhausted to argue. She thanked him and retired to the small alcove where the bed was situated. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the day's events in an endless loop. From her position, she could see Yates sitting by the fire, cleaning his pistol with practiced efficiency. In the flickering light, his profile was strong and defined, his expression distant as though his thoughts were far away. "Mr. Preston," she called softly. He looked up immediately. "Yes, you think? Is there any chance my father could still be alive?" Yates considered the question carefully before answering. "I won't lie to you, Miss Sinclair. If Blackwell's men said he's dead, the chances aren't good. But until we know for certain, there's always hope." It wasn't the reassurance she wanted, but Abigail appreciated his honesty. "Thank you for everything today. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened." A shadow passed over his face. "No need to thank me. Try to get some sleep now." As Abigail finally drifted off, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who had risked his life for a stranger. There was a story there, she could sense it in the way he carried himself, in the glimpses of emotion that occasionally broke through his controlled exterior. Whatever had brought Yates Preston to that moment on the streets of Clifton Hill, she was profoundly grateful for his presence. Little did she know that their paths crossing would alter both their lives irrevocably, setting in motion events that would test their courage, loyalty, and eventually, their hearts. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Abigail woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, her gaze immediately seeking out her rescuer. Yates was already awake, standing by the doorway in quiet conversation with Samuel, who must have returned during the night. They spoke in hushed tones, but their serious expressions told Abigail the news wasn't good. "Good morning," she said, smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could and trying to tame her tangled hair with her fingers. Both men turned, Samuel nodding in greeting while Yates offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How did you sleep?" Yates asked, moving to pour her a cup of coffee from the pot simmering over the fire. "Better than I expected," Abigail admitted, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. The rich aroma was comforting, a small piece of normalcy in her upended world. "Any news?" The men exchanged glances before Yates answered. "Samuel's been watching the roads. Blackwell's men are still searching, and they've spread the word that you're wanted for theft." "Theft?" Abigail nearly dropped her cup in shock. "That's absurd. What could I possibly have stolen?" "According to them, documents proving your father's debt to Blackwell," Samuel explained. "They claim you took them before fleeing town." Abigail shook her head vehemently. "That's preposterous. My father kept meticulous records. If he owed anyone money, I would know about it." "It's just a pretext," Yates said grimly. "A way to get the law on their side. Sheriff Mills isn't Blackwell's man, at least not yet, but he'll have to act on formal charges." Abigail sank onto the bench, trying to process this new development. "And my father, have you heard anything?" Samuel's expression softened with sympathy. "I am sorry, Miss Sinclair. I spoke with a friend who works at the undertakers in town. They brought in your father's body yesterday morning. The official cause is drowning, but—" "But what?" Abigail pressed, even as tears filled her eyes. "My friend said there were bruises on his throat," Samuel finished quietly. "Not consistent with an accidental drowning." The confirmation of her father's death and the suggestion of murder hit Abigail like a physical blow. She bent forward, wrapping her arms around herself as grief overwhelmed her. Jonathan Sinclair had been her rock, her only family, a kind and decent man who had worked tirelessly to provide for her after her mother's death. The thought of him dying alone at the hands of violent men was almost unbearable. Yates moved to sit beside her, not touching but offering his presence as silent support. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Your father deserved better." Abigail struggled to regain her composure, years of proper upbringing reminding her that even in grief, there were standards to maintain. She straightened, wiping her tears with as much dignity as she could muster. "What do we do now?" she asked, voice steadier than she felt. "First, we need to understand why Blackwell wants you," Yates said. "The store location is valuable, but kidnapping the owner's daughter seems extreme even for him." Samuel nodded agreement. "There must be more to it." "The only unusual thing," Abigail said thoughtfully, "was that my father received a letter about 2 weeks ago that seemed to upset him. He wouldn't tell me what it was about, just that he needed to set things right." "Did he say anything else?" Yates pressed. Abigail frowned, trying to recall. "He mentioned visiting our old family cabin up in the hills, said there was something there he needed, but he never when he was too busy with the store." "Where is this cabin?" Samuel asked, suddenly alert. "About 15 miles north of town, near Eagle Rock." "My grandfather built it, but we haven't used it in years." She paused, realization dawning. "You think that's where he hid whatever Blackwell is looking for?" "It's possible," Yates said, standing, "and it might be our only lead." "I'll go," Samuel offered. "I can move faster alone." Yates shook his head. "Too risky. If Blackwell's men are watching the cabin, you'd be walking into a trap. Besides, we don't know what we're looking for." "I should go," Abigail said firmly. "I know the cabin, and I might recognize whatever my father wanted to retrieve." "Out of the question," Yates replied immediately. "It's too dangerous." "Mr. Preston," Abigail said, drawing herself up to her full height, which was still nearly a foot shorter than him, "my father has been murdered. My home and business are no longer safe for me. I am being hunted by dangerous men for reasons I don't understand. I will not sit here hiding while others risk their lives on my behalf." Yates studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than most men I've known, Miss Sinclair, but courage alone won't stop a bullet." "Then teach me to shoot," she countered. "I'm a quick learner." Samuel made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. When Yates glared at him, the Osage man merely shrugged. "She reminds me of your sister." A flash of pain crossed Yates's face at the mention of his sister, so brief Abigail might have imagined it. He sighed heavily. "Fine. We'll all go, but we'll take precautions." He fixed Abigail with a stern look. "And you'll do exactly as I say without question." "This isn't a game." "I understand," she agreed solemnly. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Yates decided. "We'll travel after dark when we're harder to spot. Samuel, can you find us horses? My stallion's strong, but he can't carry 3. Samuel nodded. "There's a farm 2 miles east. The owner owes me a favor." As Samuel left to secure additional horses, Yates busied himself with preparations, checking supplies and weapons with the efficiency of a man accustomed to planning in uncertain circumstances. Abigail, feeling useless, offered to help. "You can refill these," Yates said, handing her several canteens. "There's a spring about 50 yards behind the cabin. Follow the path, can't miss it." Grateful for the task, Abigail took the canteens and stepped outside. The day was warm, the forest around the cabin alive with birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. It seemed surreal that such peace could exist when her world had been so violently disrupted. The spring was where Yates had described, a clear pool bubbling up from between moss-covered rocks. As Abigail filled the canteens, she caught her reflection in the water and hardly recognized herself. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, her face pale with fatigue and grief, her dress torn and dirty. She looked like a different woman from the respectable shopkeeper's daughter she'd been just yesterday. "Perhaps I am different now," she murmured to herself, realizing that the pampered life she'd known was gone forever. Her father's death had changed everything, forcing her to confront a world far harsher than she'd been prepared for. Returning to the cabin, she found Yates laying out several weapons on the table: 2 pistols, a rifle, and a hunting knife. "Basic shooting lesson," he announced, picking up the smallest pistol. "This one's more manageable for a beginner. Simple revolver, 6 shots." Over the next hour, Yates taught Abigail how to load, aim, and fire the weapon, emphasizing safety and proper handling. To her surprise, she took to it more readily than expected, her natural determination compensating for her lack of experience. "You've got a steady hand," Yates commented after she hit the makeshift target Akin placed on a stump 2 times out of 6 attempts. "That's better than most first-timers." Abigail found herself unexpectedly pleased by his approval. "My father always said I had a good eye. He taught me to shoot a slingshot when I was young, though Mother didn't approve." "A slingshot's not going to help much against Blackwell's men," Yates said dryly, "but the principle's similar. Keep practicing." By midday, Abigail had progressed to hitting the target 4 out of 6 times, and her confidence was growing. Yates, watching her determination with something like admiration, decided it was time for a break. As they shared a simple meal, Abigail found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. In the daylight, she could see that Yates Preston was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and the weathered complexion of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. His hands were strong and calloused, capable hands that had likely seen both work and combat. "You mentioned your sister," she ventured, curious about the man who had so drastically altered her fate. "Do you have other family?" Yates's expression closed slightly. "Not anymore. My parents died when I was young. My sister Eliza and I were raised by our uncle in Kansas." "And your sister," he hesitated, his grip tightening on his cup. "She died 6 years ago." There was a world of pain in those 4 words, and Abigail immediately regretted her question. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "It's fine," Yates replied, though his tone suggested it wasn't. "It's why I understand what you're going through, losing the only family you have. It changes you." "Is that why you live out here, away from people?" A humorless smile flickered across his face. "Partly. After the war, I found I preferred the company of trees to most men. Trees don't lie or betray you." "The war?" Abigail asked. "You fought in the Civil War," Yates nodded. "Union Army. I was young, barely 18 when I enlisted, saw things no man should see." He shook his head as if to dispel the memories. "But that's ancient history now." His reluctance to elaborate was clear, and Abigail didn't press further. Instead, she found herself sharing stories of her own life growing up in Clifton Hill, helping her father run the mercantile, the books she loved to read in her spare time. To her surprise, Yates seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and occasionally offering small smiles at her more humorous anecdotes. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Preston," Abigail admitted after a particularly long story about a disastrous attempt to bake a cake for her father's birthday. "Oh, and what did you expect?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not sure," she confessed. "Someone. Harder, perhaps. Less willing to listen to stories about failed cakes." Yates's expression softened slightly. "Don't mistake caution for callousness, Miss Sinclair. I've seen enough hardship to value small moments of lightness when they come." There was something in his gaze, then a warmth that hadn't been there before, that made Abigail's heart beat just a little faster. She looked away first, suddenly self-conscious of the disheveled state of her appearance. "I must look a fright," she murmured, attempting to smooth her hair again. "You look like someone who's survived," Yates replied simply. "There's no shame in that. Before Abigail could respond, the door opened and Samuel returned, leading 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller dappled mare. "Borrowed, not stolen," he assured Yates. "Though I doubt we'll return them soon." The arrival of the horses shifted their focus back to the mission ahead. As afternoon faded into evening, they finalized their plans. They would ride north under cover of darkness, approaching the old Sinclair cabin from an unexpected direction to minimize the chance of encountering Blackwell's men. If all went well, they would reach the cabin before dawn, search it quickly, and be gone before anyone realized they had been there. As dusk fell, Abigail changed into clothes Samuel had brought: simple men's trousers, a shirt, and a jacket that would allow her to ride more comfortably and attract less attention on the trail. She felt strange in the masculine attire, but had to admit it was far more practical than her torn dress. When she emerged from the cabin's small back room, she found Yates waiting with the horses, his expression unreadable as he took in her transformed appearance. "Those suit you better than they should," he commented, helping her secure her hair under a battered hat. "Stay close to me on the trail. If there's trouble, don't try to be a hero, run for the trees and hide. Understand?" Abigail nodded, the reality of what they were about to do settling over her like a heavy cloak. They were riding into danger, possibly straight into the path of the men who had murdered her father. Fear threatened to overwhelm her determination, but she pushed it down firmly. She would not be ruled by fear, not when the truth about her father's death was at stake. As they mounted their horses and set off into the gathering darkness, Abigail cast one last glance at the cabin that had been her sanctuary for the past 24 hours. Something told her that whatever they discovered at her grandfather's cabin would change the course of her life forever, for better or worse. The night enfolded them as they rode single file through the forest, Samuel leading, Abigail in the middle, and Yates bringing up the rear. The only sounds were the soft footfalls of their horses and the occasional call of a night bird. Above them, stars emerged one by one, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath their ancient light. Abigail couldn't help but wonder what her father would think of her now, riding through the night with 2 men she barely knew, wearing men's clothing, a pistol tucked into her belt. Jonathan Sinclair had raised his daughter to be a lady, but he had also taught her the value of courage and determination. Somehow, she felt he would understand. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, the bond forming between Abigail and her unlikely protector strengthened, though neither would have admitted it. United by circumstance and a common enemy, they were being drawn together by forces beyond their control, forces that would soon test them in ways neither could imagine. The journey to the Sinclair cabin proved more arduous than expected. What should have been a straightforward ride became complicated when they encountered a washed-out bridge over Sullivan's Creek, forcing them to make a 5-mile detour. Then, Samuel spotted fresh tracks that suggested riders had passed through recently, heading in the same direction they were. "Blackwell's men?" Yates asked in a hushed tone when they paused to water the horses at a small stream. Samuel nodded grimly. 4, maybe 5, moving fast. They know where they're going." "How could they have found out about the cabin?" Abigail whispered, dismay evident in her voice. "Someone in town must have talked," Yates replied. "Blackwell has ways of loosening tongues." "We should turn back," Samuel suggested, his usual stoicism giving way to concern. "If they reach the cabin first, they'll be waiting for us." Yates considered this, his expression troubled. "Miss Sinclair, this is your decision. It's your life at risk." Abigail felt the weight of both men's gazes. The sensible choice was clear: return to safety, find another way to discover what her father had been hiding. But something stubborn inside her rebelled at the thought of retreating. "My father died because of whatever is in that cabin," she said finally. "I can't turn back now." Yates studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we continue, but with extra caution. Samuel, can you get us there by a different route? One they wouldn't expect." "There's an old hunting trail that approaches from the west," Samuel confirmed. "Difficult terrain, but it would keep us hidden." "Do it," Yates decided. "Miss Sinclair, stay close." The difficult terrain Samuel mentioned proved to be a severe understatement. The hunting trail was little more than a deer path in places, winding through dense underbrush and across rocky slopes that seemed designed to break a horse's leg. Their pace slowed to a crawl, and more than once Abigail found herself dismounting to lead her mare through particularly treacherous sections. Despite the challenges, they pressed on, driven by determination and the growing sense that time was running out. The night deepened around them, the moon occasionally breaking through the clouds to illuminate their path before plunging them back into darkness. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Samuel raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, stood a small cabin nestled against the side of a hill. No lights burned in its windows and no horses were visible nearby, but the silence felt watchful, tense. "Wait here," Samuel whispered, sliding from his horse with fluid grace. "I'll scout ahead." Yates and Abigail waited in tense silence as Samuel disappeared into the shadows. Minutes stretched endlessly until he finally returned, his expression grave. "2 men at the back door," he reported quietly. "Armed. More inside, I think. They're searching." "Damn," Yates muttered. "They beat us here." "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, frustration evident in her voice. Yates considered their options. "They must not have found what they're looking for yet, or they wouldn't still be searching. That gives us an advantage." "How so?" Abigail frowned. "You know this cabin." "They don't." Yates turned to her, his expression intent. "Is there anywhere special your father might have hidden something? A place only family would know about?" Abigail closed her eyes, thinking back to childhood visits to the cabin. "There's a loose floorboard under the rug by the fireplace. Grandfather used to hide candy there for me, and—" Her eyes flew open. "The stone in the fireplace. The 3rd stone from the bottom on the right side it comes out. There's a space behind it." "Perfect," Yates nodded. "Now we just need to get inside." "There's a root cellar," Abigail remembered suddenly. "The entrance is outside, covered with brush. It connects to the cabin through a trapdoor in the pantry floor." Samuel and Yates exchanged impressed glances. "That could work," Samuel said, "if they don't know about it." They left the horses secured deep in the woods and approached the cabin on foot, keeping to the deepest shadows. Samuel led them in a wide arc, avoiding the men guarding the back door. The root cellar entrance was exactly where Abigail remembered, though years of neglect had caused it to be almost completely overgrown with vegetation. Working silently, they cleared just enough of the brush to open the weather-worn wooden doors. The hinges protested slightly, causing all 3 to freeze, but no alarm was raised from the cabin above. One by one, they descended into the musty darkness of the cellar. The air was thick with the smell of earth and old potatoes, the darkness nearly absolute. Yates struck a match, revealing stone walls lined with empty shelves and a dirt floor worn smooth by years of footsteps. At the far end, a narrow wooden staircase led up to what Abigail knew was the trapdoor into the pantry. "Stay behind me," Yates whispered, drawing his pistol. "If there's trouble, get back down here and run." They ascended the stairs carefully, pausing to listen at the trapdoor. The sound of men's voices filtered down to them, rough, impatient voices complaining about the fruitless search. "We've torn the place apart, Jennings," one voice growled. "There's nothing here. Keep looking," another replied sharply. "Blackwell says it has to be here. Sinclair didn't have time to move it anywhere else. What exactly are we looking for anyway? A document. Some kind of deed or map. Blackwell wasn't specific. Just said we'd know it when we saw it. Yates caught Abigail's eye, raising a questioning eyebrow. She shook her head slightly. She had no idea what document they could be referring to. They waited, tense and still, until the voices moved away from the pantry area. Then, with exquisite care, Yates eased the trapdoor open just enough to peer through. After a moment, he pushed it open further and slipped through, motioning for Abigail to follow. Samuel came last, easing the trapdoor closed behind them. The pantry was small and dark. Shelves once stocked with preserves now mostly empty save for a few dusty jars. They could hear men moving in the main room of the cabin, the sounds of furniture being overturned and floorboards being pried up. Yates put his mouth close to Abigail's ear. "Where's the fireplace from here?" "Main room," she breathed back. "We'd have to cross open space to reach it." Samuel tapped Yates's shoulder and pointed to a small window at the back of the pantry. He mimed creating a distraction, then pointed outside. Yates nodded, understanding. Samuel slipped back through the trapdoor, leaving Yates and Abigail to wait in tense silence. Minutes later, they heard a commotion from the front of the cabin, shouting, followed by the sound of running boots. "Someone's outside," a voice called. "By the trees." The cabin door slammed as men rushed out in pursuit of the phantom intruder Samuel had created. Yates immediately moved to the pantry door, checking the main room before motioning Abigail forward. "Quick," he urged. "We won't have long." They crossed to the fireplace, where Abigail knelt and felt along the stones. "This one," she whispered, pushing against the third stone from the bottom on the right side. It resisted at first, then moved inward with a scrape of stone against stone. Reaching into the dark cavity revealed, Abigail's fingers touched something wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out just as they heard boots on the porch. The men were returning. "Back to the pantry," Yates hissed, grabbing her arm. They barely made it back through the pantry door when the cabin door burst open. Crouching in the darkness, they heard angry voices. "Nothing out there but shadows," someone complained. "Waste of time." "Keep searching," the man called Jennings ordered. "It's here somewhere." Taking advantage of the renewed search, Yates and Abigail slipped back through the trapdoor and down to the root cellar. Only when they were outside again, moving swiftly through the forest toward their horses, did Abigail dare to speak. "I got it," she whispered triumphantly, holding up the oilcloth package. They met Samuel at the horses, his smile confirming the success of his diversion. "What did you find?" he asked as they mounted quickly. "We'll see when we're safely away," Yates replied, helping Abigail onto her mare. "Let's move." They rode hard for an hour, putting distance between themselves and the cabin before finally stopping in a secluded clearing to rest the horses. Only then did Abigail unwrap her precious find, revealing a stack of yellowed papers bound with twine. "Letters," she said, surprised. "And this looks like a deed." She squinted in the dim pre-dawn light, trying to make out the faded writing. "Property records for Eagle Mountain Mine." Yates's expression changed. "Eagle Mountain, are you sure?" Abigail nodded, confused by his reaction. "Yes, it's dated 1863. My father's name is on it, along with two others, William Hargrove and Victor Blackwell." "Blackwell," Yates repeated, his voice hard. "I suspected as much." "But what does it mean?" Abigail asked, scanning the documents. "Why would my father be in business with Blackwell?" "The Eagle Mountain mine was thought to be played out by 65, Samuel explained. "Many miners died there, cave-ins, bad air. It was abandoned. Until recently," Yates added grimly. "There have been rumors that Blackwell's been secretly reopening old mines if he found new silver deposits." He'd want sole ownership, Abigail finished, understanding dawning. And with my father dead and this deed missing, he could claim it all, Yates confirmed. These papers prove your father was a legal partner. Without them, Blackwell gets everything. Abigail continued reading through the letters, her expression growing more troubled. According to these, my father was planning to sell his share. He wrote to the third partner, Hargrove, about it. She looked up, distressed. The last letter is from Hargrove, warning father that Blackwell had threatened him. He was afraid. When is that letter dated? Yates asked sharply. 3 weeks ago. Abigail's hands trembled slightly. Do you think Hargrove is? We need to find out, Yates said, his jaw set. If Hargrove is still alive, he's in danger too. And he might be the only witness who can help us prove Blackwell murdered your father. The rising sun found them deep in discussion, formulating a plan that seemed equal parts desperate and determined. William Hargrove, according to the letters, lived in Independence, about 2 days' ride to the east. If they could reach him before Blackwell's men, they might find an ally in their quest for justice. But first, they needed to ensure the precious documents were safe. After much debate, they decided to split up. Samuel would take the original deed and half the letters to a trusted friend in the Osage village to the north. While Yates and Abigail would head to Independence with copies Samuel would make, and the remaining letters. If Blackwell's men catch one group, the other still has proof, Yates explained. Abigail agreed with the logic, though the prospect of separating from Samuel, whose quiet competence had become reassuring, was unsettling. Still, she trusted Yates's judgment, and the bond forming between them gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. As they prepared to part ways, Samuel took Abigail's hand in a gesture uncharacteristic of his usual reserve. "You are stronger than you know, Miss Sinclair," he said solemnly. "Your father would be proud." The simple words brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to live up to his assessment. With final instructions exchanged, and a promise to meet in 3 days' time at a designated location, Samuel rode north while Yates and Abigail headed east toward Independence and whatever awaited them there. The journey to Independence proved more challenging than anticipated. Spring rains had swollen the creeks and rivers, making crossings hazardous, and reports of Blackwell's men searching the roads forced them to take less traveled paths that often added miles to their journey. By unspoken agreement, they avoided towns and settlements, camping instead in secluded spots away from main trails. These nights beside small, carefully banked fires became a time of growing connection between them. Abigail learned that Yates had been a cavalry scout during the war, his tracking skills and knowledge of terrain making him valuable to the Union forces. After the war, disillusioned by the continuing violence and corruption, he had sought solitude in the forests of Missouri, taking work as a guide and trapper to support himself. In turn, she shared more about her life in Clifton Hill, the dreams she'd had of perhaps someday teaching at the local school, her love of literature, her close relationship with her father. Yates proved an attentive listener, his occasional questions revealing a sharp intelligence and unexpected depth of feeling beneath his reserved exterior. "You never married," he observed one evening as they sat by their small fire, the remains of a rabbit he'd caught simmering in a makeshift stew. "A woman like you must have had suitors." Abigail smiled slightly at the implied compliment. "A few. None that interested me particularly. Father always said I was too independent for my own good." "And what did you say?" "That I'd rather be independent than tied to a man who expected me to be anything less than myself." She stirred the stew thoughtfully. "What about you? No wife waiting somewhere?" Yates shook his head. "The war changed me, After, I couldn't seem to fit back into normal life. And then Eliza. He trailed off, the mention of his sister still evidently painful. What happened to her? Abigail asked gently, sensing he might be ready to share more of his past. Yates was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight with old anger. She married a man named Crawford, wealthy rancher respected in the community. I was away guiding a hunting party when it happened, but when I returned she was different, afraid. There were bruises she tried to hide. His hands clenched into fists at the memory. I confronted Crawford. He laughed, said what happened between a man and his wife was private business. "Oh, Yates," Abigail breathed, instinctively reaching across to place her hand on his arm. "What did you do? What could I do?" The law was on his side. I tried to convince Eliza to leave him, but she was afraid. Then one night, he swallowed hard. They found her at the bottom of the stairs. Crawford claimed she'd fallen. The doctor, the sheriff, all Crawford's friends ruled it an accident. "But you didn't believe that," Abigail said softly. Yates's eyes, when they met hers, burned with a fury 6 years hadn't dimmed. "I know he pushed her, and I know he watched her die. What happened to Crawford? He had an accident of his own, cleaning his gun." The cold finality in Yates's voice left no doubt about the truth of Crawford's demise. "After that, there was nothing left for me there, so I left, ended up here." Abigail didn't withdraw her hand from his arm, understanding now why he had been so quick to intervene when he saw her being forced onto a horse by Blackwell's men. In her distress, he had seen echoes of his sister's fate, a woman at the mercy of violent men, and had been unable to stand by. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, "and thank you again for saving me that day." Yates covered her hand with his own, the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond helping her on and off her horse. "Maybe I was saving myself too," he admitted, "living with regret. It hollows you out over time." In that moment, something shifted between them, a deepening of trust, a recognition of shared pain and resilience. When Abigail finally withdrew her hand to serve their simple meal, the air between them felt charged with unspoken possibility. The following day brought them within sight of Independence, its church steeples and brick buildings visible from the ridge where they paused to rest the horses. The town was larger than Clifton Hill, a bustling center of commerce with connections to the trails heading west. "We'll need to be careful," Yates cautioned as they surveyed the town from their vantage point. "Blackwell's influence likely extends here too. We can't just ride in and start asking questions about Hargrove." "How will we find him then?" Abigail asked, adjusting her hat to better shade her eyes from the midday sun. "First, we need different clothes for you," Yates decided. "A woman in men's attire attracts attention we don't need. Then we'll take rooms at a boarding house separately and make discreet inquiries." The plan was sensible, but as they approached the outskirts of town, Abigail found herself strangely reluctant to re-enter civilization. The past days on the trail with Yates had created a private world between them, free from the constraints and judgments of society. Returning to town meant resuming the expected behaviors and limitations placed on a woman of her standing. It also meant acknowledging the growing feelings she harbored for her protector, feelings that seemed both inevitable and impossible given their circumstances and the differences in their backgrounds. Yates, too, seemed more tense as they neared the town, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his responses growing shorter. The easy companionship of their nights by the fire gave way to a professional vigilance that kept Abigail at arm's length. They separated at the edge of town, Yates heading directly to the boarding house they'd agreed upon while Abigail waited with the horses in a stand of trees. He returned an hour later with a bundle of clothing, a simple but respectable dress, shawl, and bonnet purchased from a dry goods store. "The boarding house has 2 rooms available," he reported as she took the bundle. "I've secured them both, registered under the names Mr. John Preston and Miss Anna Smith, distant cousins traveling to visit family." "Cousins?" Abigail questioned, raising an eyebrow. "It explains why we might be seen together without raising eyebrows," Yates explained pragmatically. "Less suspicious than 2 strangers arriving the same day." She nodded, disappearing behind some bushes to change into the dress. It was a little large but serviceable, the blue calico fabric sturdy and unremarkable, perfect for their purposes. When she emerged, Yates's expression remained carefully neutral, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Better," he said simply. "You look like any respectable young woman now." "Isn't that the point?" Abigail replied, oddly disappointed by his detached assessment. They entered town separately, Yates first with both horses, taking them to the livery stable, while Abigail followed 20 minutes later on foot, carrying a small bundle of her few possessions. They had agreed to meet in the boarding house parlor after getting settled in their rooms. Mrs. Fletcher, the boarding house proprietress, was a plump, cheerful widow who chattered amiably as she showed Abigail to her room on the 2nd floor. "Your cousin arrived earlier, such a serious gentleman, isn't he? Not much for conversation, though handsome enough to make up for it." She winked conspiratorially. "Will you be staying long in Independence, Miss Smith?" "Just a few days," Abigail replied, adopting the soft-spoken demeanor expected of a respectable young woman. "We're visiting my mother's family before continuing west." "How lovely." "Family is so important, don't you think?" my late husband always said. Abigail listened politely to Mrs. Fletcher's reminiscences, careful to maintain her fabricated identity while gleaning what information she could about the town. By the time the landlady finally left her to unpack, she had learned several useful facts. Independence was indeed experiencing a minor boom due to renewed mining activity in the area. Victor Blackwell was known as an investor in several local businesses, and most crucially William Hargrove was a retired banker who lived on Cedar Street, though he had been ill recently and rarely left his home. This last piece of information she shared with Yates when they met in the boarding house parlor an hour later, careful to keep their conversation casual in case of eavesdroppers. "Cousin John, Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that mother's old friend Mr. Hargrove has been unwell," she said as Yates joined her near the window. "Perhaps we should pay him a visit tomorrow to convey mother's regards." Yates caught on immediately. "A fine idea, Anna. I'm sure he would appreciate the courtesy." Their eyes met in silent communication. They had their target, and would move the next morning. Until then, they would maintain their cover and rest from their journey. Dinner at the boarding house proved an unexpected challenge. Seated in the dining room with 4 other guests, a drummer selling farm equipment, an elderly couple visiting their grandchildren, and a young lawyer recently arrived to set up practice, Abigail and Yates were forced to elaborate on their fictional backgrounds, creating a web of half-truths that required constant vigilance to maintain. Yates, Abigail discovered, was surprisingly adept at this deception, weaving plausible details into their story with a naturalness that suggested previous experience in such matters. She followed his lead, careful not to contradict anything he established. "And how is your mother these days, Miss Smith?" the elderly lady asked kindly over dessert. "Very well, thank you, Mrs. Thornton," Abigail replied, recalling the fictional history Yates had established. "The mountain air in Colorado agrees with her cough." "Such a blessing," Mrs. Thornton nodded. "And Mr. Preston, You mentioned you work in the freight business. How fascinating." "Hardly fascinating, madam," Yates replied with a modest smile that transformed his usually serious face. "But it pays the bills and lets me see the country." The young lawyer, Mr. Daniels, who had been watching Abigail with poorly disguised interest throughout the meal, leaned forward. "Independence is seeing quite a boom in shipping these days, Mr. Preston. You might find opportunities here." "Is that so?" Yates responded, his tone politely interested, though Abigail could see the calculation behind his eyes. Any information could be useful. "Indeed. The mine's reopening has meant increased demand for supplies going in and ore coming out. A man with experience in freight could do well." Daniels glanced at Abigail as he added, "Perhaps well enough to settle down." The implication was clear, and Abigail felt Yates tense beside her. Before he could respond, she stepped in smoothly. "Cousin John isn't one for settling, Mr. Daniels. Mother always says he has wandering feet, just like his father." "A pity," Daniels replied, his smile directed entirely at her. "For those who might wish to keep his company." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Abigail remained aware of both Daniels's continued interest in her and Yates's growing irritation beside her. When dinner finally concluded, Yates suggested a short walk to see the town before retiring, clearly eager to speak privately. Once outside in the cool evening air, away from curious ears, his controlled facade cracked slightly. "That lawyer has his eye on you," he remarked, his tone attempting casual observation but not quite succeeding. "He's just being friendly," Abigail replied, though she had certainly noticed Daniels's attention. "He's looking for a wife to complete his new practice," Yates said bluntly. "A respectable young woman like Miss Smith would suit his purposes admirably." Abigail glanced at him, surprised by the edge in his voice. "Are you concerned his interest might compromise our cover?" Yates didn't answer directly. "We need to find Hargrove first thing tomorrow, get the information we need, and move on. The longer we stay in one place, the greater the risk." "I agree," she said carefully, studying his profile in the lamplight. "Is there something else bothering you, Yates?" He stopped walking, turning to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say something significant, something that would acknowledge the unspoken tension growing between them. Then his expression closed and he stepped back slightly. "We should return to the boarding house," he said, his voice neutral once more. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Disappointment washed through Abigail, though she knew his caution was warranted. Their mission had to take precedence over personal feelings, regardless of how compelling those feelings might be becoming. As they walked back in silence, Abigail reflected that the greatest danger they faced might not be from Blackwell's men, but from their own hearts, hers increasingly drawn to this complex, wounded man, and his clearly conflicted about the propriety of any attachment to her. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for their purported social call to William Hargrove. They left the boarding house separately, meeting a block away to approach Cedar Street together, their story prepared. Hargrove's home proved to be a modest but well-maintained clapboard house set back from the street behind a small garden. As they approached the gate, Abigail felt Yates tense beside her. "Something's wrong," he murmured, his hand moving subtly toward the pistol concealed beneath his coat. "What is it?" she whispered, immediately alert. The curtains are drawn, doors slightly ajar. His eyes scanned the street. "Stay behind me." With the casual appearance of a social caller but the cautious movements of a soldier, Yates approached the front door, Abigail close behind him. He knocked firmly, calling out, "Mr. Hargrove, John Preston and Anna Smith to see you, sir." No response came from within. After a moment, Yates pushed the door open wider, revealing a dim entryway. "Mr. Hargrove." The silence felt ominous. Yates drew his pistol now, no longer concerned with appearances. "Stay here," he instructed Abigail. "If I'm not back in 2 minutes, or if you hear anything suspicious, run. Get to the sheriff's office." Before she could protest, he slipped inside the house. Abigail waited anxiously on the porch, counting seconds in her head. She had reached 97 when Yates reappeared, his expression grim. "He's dead," he reported quietly. "Been dead at least a day, maybe 2. "Murdered?" Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Made to look like natural causes. He was elderly, apparently in poor health already, but—" Yates's jaw tightened. "There are signs of struggle in the study, papers scattered, drawers open. Someone was searching for something." "The same documents we have," Abigail realized. "Blackwell's men got here before us. We need to leave now," Yates urged, guiding her quickly down the garden path, "before someone notices the open door and raises an alarm." They had just reached the street when a voice called out behind them, "Excuse me, you there, stop." Turning, they saw a middle-aged man hurrying toward them from the neighboring house, his expression concerned. "Were you calling on Mr. Hargrove? I'm Dr. Reynolds, his physician. I was just coming to check on him." Yates made a split-second decision. "Doctor, you should know Mr. Hargrove is dead inside. We came to pay a social call and found the door ajar." The doctor's face fell. "Good Lord. I feared this might happen." His heart was very weak. He scrutinized them more closely. "You're not from Independence, are you? How did you know William?" "My mother was acquainted with him years ago," Abigail improvised quickly. "We were passing through town and thought to pay our respects." "I see," the doctor replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Well, I'll need to examine him and notify the authorities." "Would you mind waiting here while I do so? The sheriff will likely want statements." Alarm flashed in Yates's eyes, though his face remained composed. "Of course, doctor. We'll wait right here." As soon as Reynolds entered the house, Yates took Abigail's elbow. "We need to go. Now." "But the sheriff will have questions we can't answer," Yates finished urgently. "Questions that might connect us to Clifton Hill and your father's murder. We can't risk it." Understanding the danger, Abigail nodded, and they walked quickly but not suspiciously away from Hargrove's house, taking a circuitous route back to the boarding house. "Pack your things," Yates instructed as they separated at the door. "Meet me at the livery stable in 15 minutes. Say nothing to anyone about where we're going." In her room, Abigail hastily gathered her few possessions, mind racing. Hargrove's death eliminated their last potential ally and witness against Blackwell. With both her father and Hargrove dead, only the documents they carried provided any proof of Blackwell's scheme. As she hurried toward the livery stable, a sense of being watched prickled at the back of her neck. Glancing casually over her shoulder, she spotted a man she didn't recognize leaning against a storefront, his attention too deliberately focused elsewhere. Remembering Yates's lessons about evading pursuit, she ducked into a millinery shop, smiling apologetically at the proprietress as she made her way to the back door and slipped out into the alley beyond. Taking a roundabout path to the livery, Abigail arrived to find Yates already there, both horses saddled and ready. His relief at seeing her was palpable. "You're late," he said, the worry in his voice belying the simple statement. "I was followed," she explained quickly. "I lost him, I think." Yates's expression darkened. "They know we're here. We need to leave now." He helped her mount, then swung up onto his own horse. "We'll head west out of town, then circle north once we're clear. We need to meet Samuel as planned." As they rode past the outskirts of Independence, Abigail couldn't help feeling they were leaving more questions than answers behind them. Hargrove's death, clearly no coincidence, suggested Blackwell's reach was longer and his determination greater than they had anticipated. "What do we do now?" she asked once they were safely away from town, riding at a steady pace along a little-used trail. "We meet Samuel, combine what evidence we have, and take it to a federal marshal," Yates replied. "Blackwell has too much influence with local law enforcement, but federal authorities might listen, especially with evidence of murder crossing county lines. And if they don't," Yates's expression hardened, "then I'll deal with Blackwell myself." The cold certainty in his voice sent a chill through Abigail. She had glimpsed this side of him before, the capacity for violence born of his experiences in war and personal tragedy. It both frightened and reassured her, knowing he would go to such lengths to protect her and see justice done. They rode hard through the day, stopping only to rest the horses and eat a quick meal from their supplies. By nightfall, they had covered impressive distance, finding shelter in an abandoned hunter's lean-to deep in the woods. As they settled in for the night, the close quarters of the small shelter made their usual careful distance impossible. Sitting side by side before a tiny, well-concealed fire, Abigail found herself acutely aware of Yates's proximity, the warmth of his shoulder occasionally brushing hers as he moved. "I keep thinking about Hargrove," she said softly, breaking the companionable silence. "He must have been so afraid, knowing Blackwell was after him." "At least it was quick," Yates replied grimly. "Small mercy, but still. How can one man have so much power to simply eliminate anyone who stands in his way?" The injustice of it burned in her chest. "Men like Blackwell thrive in the shadows," Yates said, stoking the fire carefully. "They cultivate influence by loyalty or fear, position themselves as pillars of the community while corrupting everything they touch." "Like what happened with your sister," Abigail observed quietly. Yates nodded, his profile stark in the firelight. Crawford was respected, powerful. Who would believe he was beating his wife behind closed doors, even when she died? His voice caught slightly. Even then, the system protected him. Abigail reached out, covering his hand with hers. "But you didn't let him get away with it." "No," Yates agreed, his fingers slowly intertwining with hers. "I didn't." The simple contact of their joined hands sent warmth through Abigail that had nothing to do with the fire. For a long moment, neither spoke, the connection between them deepening in the silence. "Abigail," Yates finally said, his voice lower than usual, "when this is over," a twig snapped outside the lean-to, instantly silencing him. In a fluid motion, he extinguished the fire and drew his pistol, pushing Abigail behind him as he moved to the entrance. Tense seconds passed as they listened to the forest sounds. Then, a soft, distinctive bird call, 3 notes, a pause, 2 more. "Samuel," Yates breathed, returning the call before holstering his weapon. "He's found us." Moments later, Samuel's familiar figure materialized from the darkness. His expression was troubled as he ducked into the lean-to. "You're a day early," Yates said, striking a match to relight the small fire. "What's happened?" "Blackwell's men attacked the Osage village," Samuel replied grimly. "They were looking for me and the documents, 3 dead, including my cousin." "Dear God," Abigail whispered, horrified. "Because of us," Samuel shook his head. "Because of Blackwell, this is not your burden to carry." He produced a leather pouch from inside his shirt. "I secured the original deed before the attack, but Blackwell knows we have it now and he's growing desperate." "Hargrove is dead too," Yates informed him, quickly relating their discovery in Independence. Samuel absorbed this news with a grave nod. "Then we must move quickly. My people are gathering warriors. There will be retaliation for the attack. This could turn into a massacre," Yates warned. The army won't distinguish between justified vengeance and unprovoked attack if Osage warriors start killing white men. I know, Samuel agreed heavily. That is why I came to find you. We need to stop this before more blood is shed on either side. The three of them spent the night planning their next move. The nearest federal marshal was stationed in Jefferson City, a 3-day ride away. If they could reach him with their evidence before Blackwell realized their destination, they might finally find justice through legal channels. But if Blackwell's men intercepted them, or if the marshal proved as corruptible as the local law enforcement, they would need an alternative plan. After much debate, they decided that Yates and Abigail would make for Jefferson City, while Samuel returned to his people to urge restraint and gather additional witnesses to the attack on the village. As dawn approached, Abigail stepped outside the lean-to, needing a moment alone to process all that had happened. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. 3 Osage dead, Hargrove murdered, her father's life taken, all because of documents now in their possession. How many more would die before this was finished? She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Yates. He stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the gray light of early morning. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Not about seeing this through," she replied, gazing at the lightening sky, "but about the cost. So many lives already." "Blackwell would have killed regardless," Yates reminded her. "Your father, Hargrove, the Osage, their deaths aren't on you, they're on him." "I know that." "Logically, I know it," she sighed. "But I can't help feeling that every step we take puts more people in danger." Yates turned to face her fully, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. "Abigail, listen to me. You could walk away right now, go somewhere far from here, start a new life, let Blackwell have his mine and his power, and he would still keep killing. Men like him don't stop." The intensity in his eyes held her captive. "I'm not walking away," she assured him. "I couldn't, even if I wanted to. Not just for my father now, but for all of them." "Good," he said softly, "because I need you with me for this. Your courage, your determination." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "You've awakened something in me I thought was dead, Abigail, something I'd buried alongside Eliza." The raw honesty in his voice made her heart race. "Yates, I know the timing is wrong," he continued, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't say this. But if these past days have taught me anything, it's that life is too uncertain to waste." Before Abigail could respond, Samuel appeared at the lean-to entrance, his expression apologetic but urgent. Riders approaching from the south, at least 4, moving fast. The moment shattered, reality intruding once more. Yates's hands fell from her shoulders as he immediately shifted back into the vigilant protector. "How far?" "Quarter mile, perhaps less," Samuel replied. "We need to move now." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, erasing all signs of their presence before mounting their horses. With a brief farewell to Samuel, who would take a different route to avoid leading the pursuers to his people, Yates and Abigail set off northward, pushing their horses as fast as the rough terrain allowed. The interruption of their intimate moment lingered in Abigail's mind as they rode, Yates's unfinished declaration hanging between them. Whatever he had been about to say would have to wait. Their survival took precedence now. Yet even as they fled from immediate danger, Abigail felt a new certainty growing within her. Whatever happened in the days ahead, whatever dangers they still faced, her path was intertwined with Yates Preston's now. The connection between them, forged in crisis and deepened through shared purpose, had become something neither could deny even if circumstances continued to prevent them from fully acknowledging it. The chase was on, their pursuers relentless as they navigated the challenging terrain toward Jefferson City. Blackwell's men seemed to anticipate their movements, appearing when least expected and forcing them to change course repeatedly. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Missouri countryside, each near miss leaving them more exhausted but more determined. On the second day of their journey, as they forded a swollen creek, disaster struck. Abigail's mare lost footing on the slippery riverbed, throwing her into the rushing water. Yates was off his horse in an instant, plunging into the current after her as she struggled against the powerful flow. "Grab my hand," he shouted over the roar of the water, extending his arm toward her. Abigail fought against panic and the numbing cold of the creek, reaching desperately for him as the current pulled her downstream. Their fingers brushed, missed, then finally locked together. With tremendous effort, Yates pulled her toward him, wrapping an arm around her waist as he battled toward the shore. They collapsed on the muddy bank, soaked and gasping but alive. Abigail's mare had made it across, but was favoring one leg clearly injured. Their saddlebags, thankfully, remained intact, the precious documents protected in oilcloth. "Can you stand?" Yates asked once they had caught their breath. Abigail nodded, though her limbs felt leaden with cold and exertion. They needed to keep moving. Their pursuers couldn't be far behind, but the mare's injury complicated matters. "She can't carry weight," Yates assessed grimly after examining the horse's leg. "We'll have to continue with just my horse. Double up." It was a significant setback. One horse carrying two riders couldn't maintain the pace they needed to stay ahead of Blackwell's men. They would have to find an alternative plan. After a brief discussion, they decided to change their route completely. Instead of continuing directly to Jefferson City, they would head east toward the Mississippi River, then take a steamboat south to St. Louis, where another federal marshal was stationed. The change in transportation might throw off their pursuers and allow them to make better time despite having only one horse. The new plan meant another 2 days of hard riding to reach the river. Abigail seated behind Yates, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The forced intimacy of this arrangement made conversation difficult, limited to essential communication about their route and brief stops. During one such stop, as they rested the horse and shared a meager meal of jerky and stale biscuits, Abigail finally broached the subject of Yates's unfinished declaration from days earlier. "Before we were interrupted," she began cautiously, "you were saying something about feelings you thought were dead." Yates's gaze remained fixed on the horizon as he replied, "This isn't the time, Abigail. When will it be time?" she challenged gently. "We're being hunted across half of Missouri. Every day could be our last. If not now, when?" He turned to her then, his expression a complex mixture of longing and restraint. "If we survive this, when we survive this, I'll say everything that needs saying. I promise you that. But right now, I need to focus on keeping us alive, not on—" He gestured vaguely between them, "not on what I want." "And what is it that you want, Yates?" Abigail pressed, unwilling to let the moment pass again. For an answer, he moved toward her with sudden decision, one hand coming up to cradle her face as his lips met hers in a kiss that started gentle, but quickly deepened into something urgent and unmistakably passionate. Abigail responded instinctively, her hands gripping his shirt as she returned the kiss with equal fervor, the weeks of building tension between them finally finding release. When they eventually separated, both breathing heavily, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "That," he said simply. "That's what I want, but it complicates everything." "Some complications are worth having," Abigail replied softly, her heart racing. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." More seriously, he added, But right now we need to move. We've lingered too long already." The kiss changed nothing and everything between them. Their circumstances remained dire, their mission unchanged, but an unspoken acknowledgement had passed between them. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. They reached the Mississippi River late on the third day, arriving at a small riverside settlement where steamboats occasionally stopped for passengers and cargo. Luck was with them. A boat was due the following morning bound for St. Louis. Using some of their dwindling funds, they secured passage and a small private cabin, a necessary extravagance given their bedraggled appearance and need for privacy. The elderly couple who ran the river dock's only boarding house asked few questions, concerned only with their advance payment and assurance they wouldn't disturb other guests. That night, for the first time in days, they enjoyed the luxury of hot water for washing, clean beds, and a proper meal. The comparative safety of the steamboat dock allowed them to relax their vigilance slightly, though Yates still insisted on taking turns keeping watch. As Abigail took her shift near the window, watching the moonlight play across the mighty Mississippi, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with violence on the streets of Clifton Hill. In less than 2 weeks, she had lost her father, her home, and her former life, but she had gained something too. A strength she hadn't known she possessed, a purpose beyond the comfortable boundaries of her previous existence, and feelings for a man unlike any she had experienced before. Yates stirred on the narrow bed across the room, his features softened in sleep. The lines of constant vigilance eased from his face, making him appear younger, less burdened by the weight of his past. Watching him, Abigail felt a surge of protective tenderness that matched the fierce attraction she could no longer deny. Morning brought the welcome sight of the steamboat River Queen approaching the dock, its massive paddle wheel churning the muddy waters of the Mississippi. They boarded with the few other passengers, mostly merchants and farmers heading to St. Louis with goods to sell, and found their small cabin on the lower deck. As the boat pulled away from the dock, Abigail felt a momentary sense of relief. The river provided a new kind of freedom, the constant motion of the boat carrying them toward potential safety. But that relief was short-lived. Halfway through the first day of their journey, as they stood on deck watching the forested shoreline pass by, Yates suddenly stiffened beside her. "Don't turn around," he murmured, his hand casually coming to rest at the small of her back. "The man by the railing, dark coat, red neckerchief. I've seen him before." Abigail resisted the urge to look, instead keeping her gaze on the river. "One of Blackwell's men, I think so. He was in the saloon in Clifton Hill the day we met." Yates guided her subtly toward the stairs leading below deck. "We need to be careful. If he's seen us, others might be on board too." The relative safety of the steamboat suddenly felt like a trap. With nowhere to run if confronted, they would have to rely on stealth and the presence of other passengers to avoid direct confrontation until they reached St. Louis. For the remainder of the journey, they kept mostly to their cabin, venturing out only when necessary and never together. Yates confirmed that at least 2 of Blackwell's men were aboard the man in the red neckerchief, and another, burlier man with a distinctive scar across his jaw. "They haven't made a move yet," Yates reported after one reconnaissance trip to the upper deck. "They might be waiting until we dock in St. Louis, where they could have more men waiting. Or they might just be making sure we're really on board before sending word ahead," Abigail suggested. "If they have men stationed in St. Louis already, we'll need a new plan," Yates agreed grimly. That night, as the boat continued its steady progress southward, they discussed options in hushed tones. Direct confrontation was too risky even if Yates could overcome the 2 men on board, it would likely result in their arrest by the boat's captain, delaying them further. Attempting to leave the boat before St. Louis was equally problematic, as it would mean swimming to shore in treacherous currents or convincing the captain to make an unscheduled stop. "We need a disguise," Abigail finally suggested. "A way to walk past them when we dock without being recognized." It was a simple but potentially effective solution. The next morning, Yates approached a traveling salesman who had boarded at the same time they had, offering to buy his spare suit, hat, and valise for twice their value. The man, seeing an unexpected profit, agreed readily. For Abigail, the solution came in the form of an elderly woman traveling to St. Louis to live with her son. When Abigail explained that she was fleeing an abusive suitor, a partial truth that came easily to her lips, the woman immediately offered her spare shawl, bonnet, and spectacles to help disguise her appearance. "My Henry won't mind if I arrive with one less shawl," the woman assured her, patting her hand. "Not if it helps a young lady in distress." Their preparations complete, they waited tensely as the River Queen approached St. Louis the following afternoon. The city's waterfront came into view, bustling with activity as steamboats, flatboats, and barges loaded and unloaded cargo and passengers. Somewhere in that crowd, Blackwell's men might be waiting. "Remember," Yates said as they prepared to disembark, "walk confidently but not too quickly. If we're separated, meet at the location we discussed." Abigail nodded, adjusting her borrowed spectacles and pulling the shawl more securely around her shoulders. With her hair tucked up under the bonnet and her posture deliberately altered to suggest an older woman, she looked significantly different from her usual self. Yates, too, was transformed. The salesman's suit, slightly too small for his broad shoulders, gave him the appearance of a clerk or accountant unused to physical labor. With his beard freshly trimmed and his hat pulled low, he might pass unrecognized in a casual glance. They disembarked separately, Yates first, then Abigail several passengers later. Heart pounding, she kept her gaze lowered as she passed the man with the red neckerchief, who was scanning the departing passengers intently. He looked right through her, his attention focused on younger women who might match Abigail's description. Once on the dock, she moved steadily through the crowd, resisting the urge to look for Yates or to hurry. Their agreed meeting point was a small church 3 blocks from the waterfront neutral ground where they could regroup and plan their approach to the federal marshal's office. She had almost reached the end of the dock when a commotion erupted behind her. Turning, she saw a cluster of men surrounding someone, angry voices rising above the general din of the waterfront. With a sinking feeling, she realized Yates must have been recognized. Her first instinct was to run back toward the confrontation, but she knew that would only make things worse. Instead, forcing herself to think clearly despite her fear, she scanned the surroundings for potential help. Near the end of the dock stood a uniformed police officer, watching the waterfront with bored indifference. Making a quick decision, Abigail approached him, deliberately stumbling to draw his attention. "Officer," she called, pitching her voice higher than normal, "please help. Those men there attacking my husband." The officer straightened, his hand moving to the nightstick at his belt. "Where, madam?" "There." Abigail pointed toward the commotion. "The men in the dark coats, they're trying to rob him." Whether motivated by duty or the prospect of action to break his monotonous watch, the officer moved quickly toward the disturbance, whistle between his lips as he signaled for backup. Abigail followed at a distance, heart in her throat as she tried to glimpse what was happening. The crowd parted enough for her to see Yates, his disguise now disheveled, struggling against 3 men including the one with the red neckerchief. Despite being outnumbered, he was holding his own, his military training evident in the precision of his movements. The arrival of the police officer changed the dynamic instantly. Blackwell's men, not wanting to draw official attention, broke off their attack and melted into the crowd. The officer reached Yates, who was straightening his clothing with forced casualness. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded. "Just a misunderstanding," Yates replied smoothly. "These gentlemen thought I was someone else." "Your wife said they were trying to rob you," the officer persisted suspiciously. Yates's eyes found Abigail in the crowd, recognizing her despite the disguise. A flicker of understanding passed between them. "Ah, yes," he improvised. "They were rather insistent about checking my pockets." "Thank you for your timely intervention, officer." The officer looked between them, clearly not entirely convinced but without enough cause to detain anyone. "Be more careful where you wander on the waterfront. Sir, St. Louis ain't always friendly to strangers." With that warning, he moved off to resume his post. Yates made his way to Abigail, taking her elbow in a casual manner that suggested simple matrimonial courtesy rather than urgent need. "Quick thinking," he murmured as they walked swiftly away from the docks. "But they've seen us now. We need to move fast." "The federal marshal's office," Abigail suggested, keeping pace with his long strides. Yates shook his head slightly. "Too risky to go directly there. Blackwell's men will be watching it. We need somewhere to regroup, maybe find additional help." As they hurried through the busy streets of St. Louis, putting distance between themselves and the waterfront, Abigail felt the weight of the documents inside her dress, secured in a makeshift pocket she had sewn. So much depended on getting them to the proper authorities: justice for her father, for Hargrove, for the Osage victims, and for countless others who had suffered under Blackwell's corrupt influence. "I know someone," Yates said suddenly, changing their direction. "An old war comrade who settled here after Appomattox. If he's still in the same place, he might help us." James Rutledge, former Union captain and current owner of a modest printing shop, was indeed still at the same address Yates remembered. His surprise at seeing his old scout quickly gave way to concern as they related an abbreviated version of their situation. "Victor Blackwell," Rutledge mused, pouring them each a measure of whiskey in the small apartment above his shop. "The name's familiar. He's got investments all over the state, including here in St. Louis. Connected to some powerful people, too." "Including law enforcement?" Yates asked bluntly. Rutledge's expression was answer enough. "Not everyone," he clarified, "but enough to make walking into the marshal's office risky without knowing who you can trust." "What about Marshal Sullivan?" Abigail asked. "Is he honest?" "Sullivan's straight as they come," Rutledge confirmed. "The problem is getting to him without being intercepted. His deputy, Wallace, is another matter. Rumor has it he's on several payrolls besides the government's. This complicated matters further. If they couldn't trust the normal channels of approaching the marshal's office, they would need another way to ensure the documents and their testimony reached Sullivan directly." Rutledge, after considering the problem, offered a solution. "Sullivan attends services at St. Michael's Cathedral every Sunday morning, regular as clockwork. Sits in the same pew, third from the back on the right side. Tomorrow's Sunday. You could approach him there public enough to be safe, private enough for a discreet conversation." It seemed their best option. Rutledge generously offered them shelter for the night, converting his small sitting room into a makeshift bedroom. As night fell over St. Louis, the immediate danger passed. Abigail found herself finally able to process all that had happened. Sitting by the window, watching the city lights while Yates conferred with Rutledge about potential escape routes if things went wrong at the church, she was struck by how far she had come from the sheltered shopkeeper's daughter she had once been. the woman who now wore a pistol hidden in the folds of her borrowed dress, who had outwitted dangerous men and traveled across the state with a price on her head, seemed like a different person entirely. Later, as they prepared for sleep in Rutledge's modest accommodations, Yates approached her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Tomorrow could change everything," he said quietly, standing close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to their host in the next room. "If Sullivan takes our evidence, if he acts on it, then Blackwell might finally face justice," Abigail finished for him, "and we might be safe at last." "Yes." Yates seemed to struggle with his next words, "but it also means decisions about what comes after." Abigail understood immediately. Once their shared mission was complete, once the danger that had bound them together was past, they would need to determine what remained between them if the connection forged in crisis could survive in peace. "Whatever comes after," she said, reaching for his hand, "I want to face it with you, Yates. That much I know for certain." The simple declaration seemed to ease something in him, his fingers interlaced with hers, warm and strong. "When I first saw you in Clifton Hill being forced onto that horse," he said softly, "I acted on instinct. I had no idea that saving you would end up saving me too." "Saving you?" Abigail questioned. "From the half-life I was living," he explained. "Existing but not really alive, hiding from connections that might hurt me again." His free hand came up to touch her cheek gently. "You brought me back to life, Abigail Sinclair." The tenderness in his touch, the raw honesty in his words, melted something inside her that had been frozen since her father's death. Standing on tiptoe, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed all she couldn't yet put into words: her gratitude, her admiration, and the love that had grown steadily despite the chaos surrounding them. When they separated, Yates's eyes held a promise that needed no articulation. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, their fates now irrevocably intertwined. Morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn Sunday in St. Louis. Rutledge provided them with fresh clothes suitable for church attendance, a modest dress for Abigail, and a clean suit for Yates, both borrowed from friends of the printer who were approximately the right sizes. "Remember," Rutledge cautioned as they prepared to leave, "Sullivan will be with his family. Approach respectfully, mention my name if needed, and be direct but discreet. The cathedral will be crowded, that's your protection, but also your challenge." Yates nodded, checking that his pistol was secure but hidden beneath his borrowed jacket. "If we're not back by noon, I'll send word to friends who can help," Rutledge promised. "But you'll be back. Sullivan's a good man, he'll listen." St. Michael's Cathedral was indeed crowded when they arrived, the faithful of St. Louis gathering for the morning service. They slipped into a pew near the back, positioning themselves where they could observe the entrance while remaining relatively inconspicuous. Marshal Sullivan arrived with his wife and 2 young daughters just before the service began, taking his usual seat 3 pews ahead of them on the right side, just as Rutledge had predicted. He was a tall, distinguished man with iron-gray hair and the erect posture of someone accustomed to command. Throughout the service, Abigail found it difficult to concentrate on the prayers and hymns, her attention constantly drawn to scanning the congregation for potential threats. Yates, beside her, maintained a similar vigilance while presenting the outward appearance of respectful attention. When the service concluded, they waited as parishioners began to file out, timing their movement to intercept Sullivan as he guided his family toward the exit. Yates approached first, Abigail half a step behind him. "Marshal Sullivan," Yates said quietly, close enough to be heard but not so close as to appear threatening. "My name is Yates Preston. James Rutledge suggested I speak with you on a matter of some urgency." Sullivan studied them with keen eyes, noting their tense posture and the respectful but determined set of their expressions. After a brief hesitation, he turned to his wife. "Martha, take the girls to the carriage. I'll join you shortly." Once his family had moved ahead, Sullivan led them to a quiet alcove near the cathedral's side entrance. "Rutledge is not a man who makes frivolous recommendations," he said without preamble. "What's this about?" Concisely but thoroughly, Yates explained their situation: Jonathan Sinclair's murder, the partnership deed for the Eagle Mountain mine, William Hargrove's suspicious death, and the attack on the Osage village. Abigail provided the documents as he spoke, unwrapping them from their protective covering with careful hands. Sullivan examined the papers with growing concern, his expression darkening as he reviewed the evidence of Blackwell's crimes. "This is serious," he acknowledged. "Multiple murders across county lines, fraud, an attack on Indian territory, federal jurisdiction without question." He looked up sharply. "But Blackwell has powerful friends. Taking him down won't be simple." "We understand the risks," Abigail said firmly. "But my father deserves justice, as do all the others who have died because of Blackwell's greed." The marshal studied her with newfound respect. "You're a brave young woman, Miss Sinclair." Turning to Yates, he added, "And you took considerable personal risk getting her and these documents to safety." "It was the right thing to do," Yates replied simply. Sullivan nodded, coming to a decision. "I'll need you both to come to my home, not my office. It's too public, and as you suggested, I'm not certain which of my staff I can trust completely. My wife will understand the necessity." He pocketed the documents carefully. "We'll take formal statements, then I'll arrange safe accommodation while I organize a proper investigation and arrests." Relief washed through Abigail. After weeks of danger and uncertainty, it seemed justice might finally be within reach. She glanced at Yates, seeing the same cautious optimism in his eyes. As they followed Sullivan out of the cathedral's side entrance toward his waiting carriage, however, the peaceful morning shattered. 3 men emerged from behind a nearby monument, guns already drawn. "That's far enough, Marshal," the leader called a tall man with cold eyes whom Abigail recognized with a start as one of the 2 who had tried to force her onto a horse that fateful day in Clifton Hill. "We'll take those papers now." Sullivan, to his credit, didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he pushed Abigail and Yates behind him while drawing his own weapon. "Federal Marshal," he announced clearly, "lower your weapons or face the consequences." Instead of complying, the leader fired, the shot going wide as Sullivan returned fire with much greater accuracy. The man crumpled with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. His companions, seeing their leader fall, hesitated just long enough for Yates to draw his pistol and fire twice in rapid succession, forcing them to dive for cover behind the monument. "My carriage, quickly," Sullivan urged, backing toward the street where churchgoers were scattering in panic at the sound of gunfire. They had almost reached the relative safety of the vehicle when 2 more of Blackwell's men appeared from around the corner of the cathedral. One fired immediately, the bullet striking Sullivan in the leg. The marshal stumbled but remained standing, returning fire with grim determination. In the chaos that followed, Abigail found herself separated from both men as panicked civilians ran in all directions. A hand grabbed her arm, roughly one of Blackwell's men, his face twisted with malicious triumph. "Gotcha," he snarled, trying to drag her toward an alley. Remembering Yates's lessons, Abigail didn't struggle directly against his stronger grip. Instead, she went suddenly limp, dropping her weight unexpectedly. As the man instinctively bent to compensate, she drove her knee upward with all her strength, connecting solidly with his groin. His grip loosened as he doubled over in pain, giving her the opportunity to pull the small pistol from her dress pocket. She didn't fire too many innocent people nearby, but the sight of the weapon was enough to make the injured man back away, cursing. Looking frantically for Yates, she spotted him engaged in hand-to-hand combat with another of Blackwell's men, his gun apparently empty. Despite being evenly matched in size, Yates's military training gave him an advantage, and he soon gained the upper hand, delivering a knockout blow that sent his opponent crashing to the ground. Sullivan, meanwhile, had taken cover behind his carriage, exchanging fire with the remaining assailants. Though wounded, the marshal fought with the skill and courage of a man long accustomed to dangerous situations. Abigail made her way to Yates, keeping low and using the confusion to her advantage. "The documents," she gasped as they crouched behind a stone planter. "Sullivan has them." "And we need to make sure he keeps them," Yates replied grimly, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. "Stay here." Before she could protest, he was moving again, circling behind the attackers to approach from an angle they weren't watching. The distraction allowed Sullivan to get a clear shot at one more of Blackwell's men, who fell with a cry of pain. The remaining gunmen, seeing their advantage evaporating, began to retreat. One fired a final shot toward Sullivan's carriage before they disappeared down an alley, the sound of their running footsteps quickly fading. In the sudden silence that followed, Abigail rushed to where Sullivan leaned heavily against his carriage wheel, his pants leg darkening with blood. "Marshal, are you badly hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "I'll live," he grimaced, pressing a handkerchief against the wound. "Not the first time I've been shot in the line of duty." He patted his pocket where the documents were secured. "More importantly, our evidence is safe." Police whistles sounded in the distance, approaching rapidly. Yates joined them, his knuckles bloodied but his expression relieved. "We need to get you to a doctor," he told Sullivan, "and then finish what we started." Sullivan nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly, Preston." To Abigail he added with unexpected gentleness, "Your father would be proud, Miss Sinclair. Not many would have shown the courage you've demonstrated." Before she could respond, Sullivan's carriage driver appeared, having hidden during the gunfight. With his help, they got the wounded marshal into the carriage. Yates and Abigail climbed in after him, and they departed just as the first police officers arrived at the scene. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Sullivan was treated by his personal physician, the bullet removed from his thigh and the wound bandaged. Despite the doctor's orders to rest, the marshal immediately began organizing a federal response to Blackwell's crimes. Telegrams were sent to Jefferson City, requesting additional marshals. Trusted deputies were dispatched to secure the Eagle Mountain mine with orders to arrest anyone connected to Blackwell. Most importantly, a warrant was issued for Victor Blackwell himself on charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Throughout this flurry of official action, Abigail and Yates remained at Sullivan's home, protected by guards the marshal trusted implicitly. They provided formal statements, examined photographs of known associates of Blackwell to identify those involved in various attacks, and finally, exhausted but relieved, were offered guest rooms to rest. "Blackwell won't escape justice now," Sullivan assured them before retiring to his own room against his wife's protests that he should be in hospital. "The evidence is too strong, the crimes too severe. Even his political connections can't save him from federal charges." As night fell over St. Louis, Abigail found herself standing on the small balcony outside her assigned room, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The enormity of all that had happened, and all that had changed in the weeks since her father's death washed over her in waves. A soft knock at her door broke her reverie. Opening it, she found Yates standing there, his expression both tired and somehow lighter than she had ever seen it. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Abigail stepped aside to admit him, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of receiving him in her bedroom, regardless of the innocent nature of his visit. Social proprieties that had seemed irrelevant during their desperate flight now reasserted themselves awkwardly. Yates seemed to sense her discomfort. "I won't stay long," he assured her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I just wanted to check that you're all right." "I'm fine," she replied, though the words felt inadequate to describe the complex mixture of grief, relief, exhaustion, and hope she was experiencing. A little overwhelmed by it all, Yates nodded, understanding. "It's a lot to process, but you did it, Abigail. You've secured justice for your father. Not many could have endured what you have these past weeks." "We did it," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Yates." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Yates took a step toward her, his expression serious. "In the church, before everything happened, I was thinking about what comes next," he said. "About what I want after this is truly over." Abigail's heart quickened. "And what is it you want?" "A chance," he replied simply. "A chance to know you in peacetime, without danger pressing on us from all sides. A chance to see if what's grown between us can flourish in ordinary life." The honesty of his request touched her deeply. No grand declarations, no assumptions, just a sincere desire to explore the connection they both felt, with the proper time and space to do so. "I want that too," she admitted softly. "More than I can say." Relief and joy mingled in Yates's smile, a full, genuine smile that transformed his features and made him appear years younger. Unable to resist, Abigail closed the distance between them, her arms circling his neck as she raised her face to his. Their kiss held all the promise of the future they both hoped for, tender yet passionate, a commitment without words that nonetheless spoke volumes. When they finally parted, Yates rested his forehead against hers, his arms secure around her waist. "When this is finished," he murmured, "when Blackwell is behind bars and you're truly safe, will you come with me to the cabin? Not to hide, but to begin something new." "Yes," Abigail whispered without hesitation. "Wherever you go, Yates Preston, I want to be by your side." It was another week before Blackwell was finally apprehended, cornered in a hunting lodge near the Kansas border, where he had fled upon hearing of the federal warrant for his arrest. He fought to the end, wounding one marshal before being subdued and transported back to St. Louis in chains. Abigail insisted on being present at his arraignment, needing to see with her own eyes the man responsible for her father's murder. Victor Blackwell proved smaller than she had imagined, a middle-aged man of average height, with thinning hair and cold eyes that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts as the charges against him were read. When the judge denied bail, citing the severity of the charges and Blackwell's obvious flight risk, a small measure of peace settled into Abigail's heart. It wasn't the complete closure she might have wished for. Nothing could bring her father back, but it was justice, and it would have to be enough. "Ready to go home?" Yates asked quietly as they left the courthouse, his hand steady at the small of her back. Abigail considered the question thoughtfully. Clifton Hill had been home her entire life, but the store without her father would never be the same. The cabin where Yates lived was remote and rustic, but in the weeks since her rescue, it had come to represent safety and new beginnings. "Yes," she decided, "I'm ready." They traveled first to Clifton Hill, where Abigail settled her father's affairs with the help of the town lawyer. The store was sold to a young couple eager to establish themselves in business, the proceeds providing Abigail with a comfortable nest egg. Personal mementos and family treasures were carefully packed and stored until she could decide their ultimate fate. The town had changed in her absence, or perhaps she had changed too much to fit back into the life she had once known. Either way, when she and Yates rode out of Clifton Hill 2 weeks later, she felt no regret, only a quiet anticipation for the future they would build together. They stopped at the Osage village on their journey north, where Samuel greeted them with quiet satisfaction at the news of Blackwell's arrest and the federal investigation that was now examining all of his business dealings. The tribe had received formal acknowledgement of the attack and promises of restitution, small comfort for those lost, but a step toward justice nonetheless. "You will always be welcome among my people," Samuel told Abigail as they prepared to depart. "Your courage honors your father's memory." The autumn woods were ablaze with color as they finally approached Yates's cabin, their cabin now, by mutual agreement. The simple structure looked exactly as Abigail remembered from that first night of sanctuary, yet somehow different too. No longer just a hiding place, it now represented possibility, a fresh start, a home they would create together. "It needs work," Yates admitted as they dismounted, surveying the cabin critically. "Another room, maybe, better windows for the winter, a proper garden come spring." "It's perfect," Abigail replied, slipping her hand into his. "We'll make it what we need it to be together." The word "together" seemed to strike a chord in Yates. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Abigail Sinclair," he said solemnly, "these past months have shown me what kind of woman you are: brave, determined, compassionate, stronger than you know. I love you for all of that, and for the way you've brought me back to life when I thought that part of me was gone forever." Abigail's eyes filled with tears at the simple, heartfelt declaration. "And I love you, Yates Preston, for saving me that day in Clifton Hill, yes, but more for the man you are: honorable, loyal, fiercely protective of those you care for. You've helped me discover strengths I never knew I had." Yates's expression grew even more serious. "I'm not a wealthy man. This cabin, some savings, my skills as a guide and trapper, that's what I can offer. It's not the comfortable life you knew, it's a life with meaning," Abigail interrupted gently. "A life with purpose and love. That's worth more than any comfort I left behind." With careful reverence, Yates removed a small object from his pocket, a simple gold ring with a modest pearl set in its center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The one thing of hers I've kept all these years. I've been carrying it since St. Louis, waiting for the right moment." His voice deepened with emotion. "Abigail Sinclair, will you marry me? Make this cabin our home, build a life with me here?" "Yes," Abigail whispered, her heart so full she could barely speak. "With all my heart, yes." As Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that sealed their promise to one another, Abigail reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. A path that had begun in violence and fear on the streets of Clifton Hill, when two men forced her toward a waiting horse, and a cowboy knocked them down, taking her away to safety and ultimately to love. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling minister, with Samuel and James Rutledge, who had made the journey from St. Louis specifically for the occasion, as their witnesses. Abigail wore a new dress of soft blue silk, her one concession to luxury, while Yates looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit, his hair freshly trimmed and his usually serious face alight with happiness. As winter settled over the Missouri hills, the newlyweds worked together to improve their home. Yates built an additional room as promised, with large windows that let in the winter sunlight. Abigail established a cozy domestic routine, transforming the bachelor's cabin into a true home with curtains sewn from fabric purchased in the nearest town, shelves for the books she treasured, and the few family mementos she had brought from Clifton Hill. News eventually reached them that Victor Blackwell had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The Eagle Mountain Mine, legally 1/3 Abigail's inheritance from her father, was sold to a mining company with a reputation for fair treatment of workers. The proceeds added to the nest egg that gave the couple financial security. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As the forest around their cabin erupted in fresh green growth and wildflowers, Abigail confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was expecting their first child. Yates's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy mingled with protective tenderness and a deep, abiding love that showed in every glance, every touch. His experience with loss had made him value life's blessings all the more deeply, and the prospect of fatherhood awakened new dimensions of his already complex character. By summer, their homestead had expanded to include a vegetable garden, a small orchard of young fruit trees, and 2 milk cows, practical additions that represented their commitment to building a sustainable life together. Yates still occasionally guided hunting parties or undertook trapping expeditions, but increasingly found satisfaction in working their own land, creating something lasting for their growing family. Abigail, whose education had been better than most women of her time, began tutoring the children from neighboring farms and homesteads. What started as informal lessons around their kitchen table gradually evolved into a small school as word spread of the former shopkeeper's daughter who taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history with equal passion. Their son, Jonathan, named for Abigail's father, was born as autumn painted the hills gold and crimson once more. He had Yates's dark hair and Abigail's determined chin, a combination that both parents agreed boded well for his future character. Samuel became a regular visitor to their home, teaching the young family Osage traditions and stories that might otherwise have been lost. Through his influence, they developed relationships with the local tribe that benefited both communities, establishing a rare harmony in a time when such connections were often marked by mistrust. As the years passed, their family grew to include a daughter, Eliza, named for Yates's sister, a way of honoring her memory while creating new, joyful associations with the name. Later came another son, Michael, completing their family circle. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, how 2 men were forcing their mother onto a horse, and their father knocked them down and took her away to safety. It became family lore, a tale of courage and destiny that shaped their understanding of the world. What the children understood only as they grew older was how that moment of intervention had changed not just their mother's life, but their father's as well, how 2 wounded souls had found healing in one another, how love had flourished in the most unlikely circumstances, and how the family they created together represented redemption and second chances for them both. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful day in Clifton Hill, Yates and Abigail stood together on the porch of their now expanded home, watching their children play in the summer twilight. Their homestead had prospered, their community connections had deepened, and the love between them had matured into something even richer than the passionate connection that had first drawn them together. "Any regrets?" Yates asked quietly, his arm around his wife's waist. Abigail leaned into his embrace, considering the question seriously. "About us? Never," she replied with certainty. "About the path that brought us here. I wish my father could have known you, known our children, but I've made my peace with the past." Yates nodded, understanding. I think about Eliza sometimes, how she never had the chance to find what we have. But then I look at our daughter, carrying her name into a better future, and I find comfort in that continuity. "We've built something good here," Abigail said, surveying their homestead with justified pride. "Something that honors those we've lost while creating new joy." "We have," Yates agreed, turning to face her fully. At 40, he was still as handsome as the day they'd met, though silver now threaded his dark hair at the temples. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter more than hardship, these days evidence of the healing their life together had brought. "And I'm grateful every day for that moment of impulse that made me step in when I saw you in trouble." Abigail smiled up at him, her heart as full of love as it had been on their wedding day. "Some impulses change everything," she said softly. "That one saved us both." As twilight deepened into night, they called their children home, the family gathering in the warm light of their cabin, so different now from the sparse bachelor dwelling it had once been. Looking around at the faces of those she loved most in the world, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the journey from terror to joy had been worth every step, every struggle, every moment of fear. Life in the West was never easy. They faced droughts and harsh winters, occasional conflicts and economic challenges, but they faced each obstacle together, their bond strengthened by the knowledge of what they had already overcome. Their home became a haven not just for their immediate family, but for travelers, neighbors in need, and anyone seeking shelter from life's storms. Years later, when their children were grown and beginning families of their own, Yates and Abigail would still sometimes sit on their porch in the evening, hands clasped between them, marveling at the unlikely path that had brought them together, a path that began with violence but led to a love story that would be told and retold through generations to come. A love story that began when two men were forcing her onto a horse. A cowboy knocked them down and took her away, not just to safety, but to a future brighter than either of them could have imagined on that dusty street in Clifton Hill so many years before.